Welcome to How to Get on a Watchlist, the new podcast series from Encyclopedia Geopolitica. In each episode, we'll sit down with leading experts to discuss dangerous activities. From assassinations and airliner shootdowns through to kidnappings and coups, we'll examine each of these threats through the lenses of both the dangerous actors seeking to conduct these operations and the agencies around the world seeking to stop them.
In the interest of operational security, certain tactical details will be omitted from these discussions. However, the cases and threats which we discuss here are very real.
I'm Louis H. Besant, the founder and co-editor of Encyclopedia Geopolitica. I'm a researcher in the field of intelligence and espionage with a PhD in intelligence studies from Loughborough University. I'm an adjunct professor in intelligence at Sciences Po Paris, and in my day job, I provide geopolitical analysis and security-focused intelligence to private sector corporations.
I'm Alexandra Szokiewicz, a co-editor of Encyclopedia Geopolitica. I'm a multilingual security and intelligence professional with a master's in international security from Sciences Po Paris. I have served in both consulting and in in-house roles, bridging the gap between analysis and operations, and focusing on threat identification and monitoring, geopolitical intelligence and strategy, and security support to various public and private audiences.
So today we're talking about how to stalk a celebrity, and we've got two fantastic guests lined up to talk about this with us, Angela Lewis and Caleb Gilbert. So firstly, Dr. Angela Lewis is the head of global intelligence, investigations and threat management for a talent agency that represents many of the most well-known sports and entertainment figures. She's also an adjunct professor and teaches intelligence courses at Georgetown University, the University of Cincinnati, and the University of New Hampshire. Prior to working in the private sector, Dr. Lewis served as a senior counterterrorism targeting officer in the CIA's Directorate of Operations with multiple tours abroad. She holds a PhD from Pepperdine University, where her studies focused on leveraging intelligence for strategic decision-making.
Caleb Gilbert is the founder and president of White Glove Protection Group with over 2 decades of experience in executive protection for clients across the Fortune 100 and 200, as well as private family offices. His expertise spans close protection for A-list celebrities, ultra-high net worth individuals, and corporate protection and intelligence teams. A certified protection specialist from Executive Security International, Caleb holds an associate's degree in Homeland Security and an undergraduate degree in security management from Southwestern College. He also earned a graduate certificate in international security from Stanford University and a master's degree in global security studies from Johns Hopkins University. Caleb makes numerous contributions to the executive protection community, including as vice chair of the ASIS International's executive protection community. In this role, he champions initiatives supporting women in protection, mentorship, and leadership development. Caleb also serves on the board of directors for the International Protective Security Board.
Well, Caleb and Angie, thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much for having us.
So a question we always like to ask our guests, and in this case, I'm really excited to hear your answers, is how did you get into your line of work? It's a pretty niche field. How did you find yourself doing this for a living?
So for me, I kind of grew up, if you will, professionally in the CIA's Directorate of Operations. I was a targeting officer. And so a lot of the work that I did was really looking at how to create opportunities to build contact with people. So maybe that was finding their locations, understanding their pattern of life, things like that. And so it was a little bit of the kind of reverse side of what we're talking about today. And then, of course, when I shifted gears from the public sector to the private sector, I found myself in the entertainment industry. And I really kind of fell in love with the work that the entertainment industry does and the unique ways that I could bring sort of my security and intel background to support and assist and help the creative types out there to do their best work on a daily basis.
For me, it was a very untraditional path. I fell in love with the concept of executive protection when I was 16. I quit school at 13 because I had zero interest in academics and was horrible at it. And so I literally started working security, moved to Hollywood, went to executive protection school, paid my own way through the executive protection training that I could get, and then started working with every celebrity as the years passed on, worked my way up through the industry, lived with several celebrities, traveled the world, really immersed in that entire culture for the first portion of my career. Then as I started near the end of my 20s, I had a protectee that said, Caleb, I like you, but you need an education. And so I was like, I quit school at 13 because I hated it. I don't want to start now, But he was very emphatic about it. And so that's when I started my academic pursuit. Through that process, I spent 11 years in academia, kind of rounding out the school of hard knocks that had formed me as the protector that I became. That allowed me to work into private family offices, corporations, and really use my protection, unique flavor of protection, if you will, to infuse the protection industry with a little more personalized touch, a little more industry specific character. A lot of tactics and techniques that my different teams have developed over the years have been specifically curated for the private sector because I simply don't have the government background to rely on. And so I had to literally create my own. So it's been a fun combination, a fun progression, and I love learning along the way.
That's some really interesting backgrounds. I'm really keen to draw on your expertise as we get into this then. So I think let's kick this off. What are the biggest risks to celebrities? Why are celebrities, why do they need this kind of support? What is it that they should be concerned about?
Yeah. So I think this really runs the gamut, and it can be anything from, obviously that invasion of privacy to, physical security and even death threats. I guess celebrities are obviously in the spotlight, so the line gets kind of blurry for many. And in particular, those that are inappropriately fixated on them. There's an erosion of their privacy, and this can undermine a celebrity's confidence and their feelings of safety, and it interferes with their work sometimes. So even if something doesn't seem to rise to the level of concern of, say, a death threat, for example, it can have a serious impact on their life and their livelihood and how they go about doing their work. That psychological impact on victims can be really significant. So, in addition to the physical safety concerns and kind of the means by which those victims might take the measures to protect themselves, like, installing security cameras or changing their routines or having, people like Caleb and a physical protector or, even sort of legal protections like restraining orders, there can be significant psychological impacts too, that the chronic anxiety, emotional distress, feelings of helplessness and depression and fear and isolation. And that can cause victims to withdraw from social situations, from work, or from other public places to avoid that harassment. So I think that, like I said, those risks really run the gamut, both physical, but then it's also psychological as well.
Couldn't agree with you more, Angela. You look at a lot of the celebrities that I've worked with have really felt the personal impact of exactly what you're speaking to. You look at people that are in the public eye, right? These people are out there and they are successful because the public's impression of them falls in line with what the public's expectations are. And so you have A-list celebrity, they're out there and they're impacted by a nefarious actor, a stalker, whatever it might be. That changes their ability to be the persona that most people see day in and day out. And that's a delineation from the star that people see, And so you look at, traditionally we think of celebrities and the risks that they face as the threat to life, limb, and loss. But literally a celebrity's career can be over just because of the psychological impacts, the devastating effects of those nefarious actors that we don't hear about every day.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And Caleb, you just mentioned A-type celebrities, and I'm wondering which type of celebrities actually draw the most attention and the dangerous and unsolicited attention for something like this. Are there any particular types of folks working in particular sectors that would be more exposed than others to something like this?
Well, you look at some celebrities thrive on kind of doing crazy acts, jumping on couches and different things that they are known for, right? And for me, having been in those places where the celebrities were doing those acts, it was interesting for me to see, all right, what part of this is the celebrity being a celebrity and drawing that attention? And then the others that their life is kind of a bowling ball of catastrophe that just really attracts attention and kind of snowballs as it goes along. And so I'd say the celebrity that's career snowballs is at the greatest risk of both falling off of the A-list track and B, falling into a level of celebrity that's not in line with where they want it to go to keep the compensation coming in.
Absolutely. I would agree with that completely. I think a couple of sort of, I don't know if you want to call them like demographic areas where you see, celebrities who are getting a lot of attention. It can be the outspoken celebrities who are taking on, activist issues and things like that. That can be a big one because not only do they have their kind of stardom that is garnering attention, but then they can also get the attention of people who maybe disagree with their political or environmental or social stances. So I think that that's, one of the big places where you can see sort of more obsessive stalkers. I think, obviously, there are a lot of high profile stories of women in particular, who have had stalkers. It doesn't just happen to women, it happens to men as well. But then, one thing to consider is sort of the sexualization of women, their accessibility, media portrayal, the emotional investment of their fan bases. So when you're thinking about who's most likely to get a stalker, some of those factors do come into play. A lot of stalkers are driven by a distorted sense of connection or obsession with a celebrity, which leads to harmful actions, obviously. So I bring up that sort of sexualization factor because many celebrities who are seen as sex symbols or who cultivate an image of, romance or fantasy can also tend to attract very obsessive fans. But again, we see obsessive fans in a myriad of sectors. So by no means associated with just one specific demographic.
One of my favorite protectees of all time was just what you described there. And she was my favorite protectee because literally for 9 months, I was with her the majority of the time, and she had that obsessive stalker that followed her day in and day out. She'd change her phone number. The stalker would get her phone number. This is back, when landlines were more prevalent, if you will. But she would take and change her phone number. The stalker would get her phone number, and that would scare her even more, It finally escalated to the point to where the stalker somehow was getting her location information and would show up randomly when we were out in Beverly Hills, just show up, pull up right next to us. And, the psychological impacts that we talked about before, were devastating. But the things that he said, the disrespect, the things that he pushed out there that were baseless, he was psychologically disturbed. None of it was factual. But all of that was so devastating to him because, she had been a child actress that had grown up, become, the sex symbol, if you will, as she progressed. And now she was at a phase in her life to where she had, moved past that and was trying to portray a little more mature acting. And she just completely felt degraded by that, And so the process of that escalation throughout the months just increasingly struck terror into her heart, to where she didn't want to go anywhere unless we were with her, And talk about a miserable way to live your life.
Yeah, for sure. Is there any particular threshold when you would consider something to be stalking? Is there even something like a sort of generally accepted legal definition? Does that differ between jurisdictions? And how do you differentiate between paparazzi and actual stalking behavior? Or does that fall into sort of the same category? Where do you draw the line, right?
Paparazzis are permanent stalkers, it's an aspect of the industry that you just learn to manage it. Sometimes you can manage it through professional relationships, just taking the paparazzi aside. You have the same, 150 people following you everywhere. So day after day, month after month, they know, they would follow me home when I would drive home and offer me money to, actually give them the shot type of deal, And so outlining the professional nature of, hey, this is not acceptable. This is acceptable. If you want your shot, then respect the protectee. We'll have an opportunity for you to get your shot. You'll be able to make your payday, but don't try to sit here and crash the party or do anything out of line with expectations. Otherwise, we will do our job, And several times we over the course of my career, my team has done our jobs and we shut entire swaths of paparazzi out of events and made them so bloomin' mad that they literally were trying to drive through fences to get to where we were because there were $3 million shots at stake, inside that venue, And so developing those relationships with the paparazzi and clearly delineating where the lines of acceptable behavior are, it has been extremely important for my teams over the years.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely, on target with what I've seen as well. And I think one of the things that Caleb really brought up that is so critical is boundary setting. It's really just kind of saying it's establishing that level of comfort and kind of what the celebrity is comfortable with and making sure that those boundaries are respected. And there can be a, if slightly contentious, but relatively positive relationship with the paparazzi, if they are willing to kind of abide by those boundaries. Going back to the question about the definition of stalking, it does vary by jurisdiction, but there are a few kind of standard elements that go with it. It's generally repeated and willful acts. So like the behavior is intentional and it's repetitive, maybe repeatedly contacting or following somebody. It's that pattern of behavior. So it could be a combination of factors, but it's conducted over a period of time, maybe sending unwanted messages or showing up uninvited or using, technology to track the victim. And then there is that threat of harm. So most legal definitions, at least, will include that requirement that the victim have a reasonable fear for their safety or the safety maybe of their family or loved ones. And then I'll add a little note that cyber stalking, using the electronic means to stalk or harass someone, has been included as part of the broader stalking statutes due to its growing prevalence. So as far as the official definition, it does vary by jurisdiction, but that tends to be some of the tenets that are included.
As well as the delineation that it is not psychologically or ideologically motivated. When somebody's paparazzi, they're doing it for a paycheck. Somebody that's ideologically or psychologically disturbed to the point to where they're actually pursuing that stalker, then that's definitely within the realm of stalker definitions.
So how extreme can stalkers become? What are some of the most kind of egregious examples you've come across? At the top of my head, when we're talking about stalkers, I'm thinking about, John Hinckley shooting Ronald Reagan to impress Jodie Foster. So it feels like nothing's kind of off the table here, right?
Absolutely. If you can imagine it, a stalker probably can too. So, that combination of obsessive behavior, delusional thinking, the willingness to break boundaries and laws makes extreme stalking cases pretty unpredictable and dangerous. So most of us who kind of work in this field are trained to, at some level, expect the unexpected, but it does make it challenging to be proactive because you're always sort of the obscure or unexpected can be the one thing that you need to account for. You're not always working in the realm of the rational. So obviously, much of the time there is a mental health issue at hand that also will play into the level of delusion and your ability to sort of anticipate their next step and their likely reaction or not to some of the mitigation measures that you might put in place. So I know Caleb probably has some examples as well, but I would say, physical confrontations, forced encounters, breaking and entering, threats of violence or death, impersonating the victim or the victim's family members, following or surveillance over long periods of time, destruction or vandalism of property, sending threatening or obsessive gifts, harassing or intimidating close friends or family members of the victim, kidnapping or attempted abduction, cyberstalking and doxing. Those are, a list of things, but, if it's something uncomfortable, it's probably something that a stalker has done or has considered in some way.
Absolutely. The creativity of stalkers is mind-blowing at times, One of the A-list celebrities that I had the pleasure of protecting had a stalker that literally went through the process to legally change her name to the protectee's wife's full name and went through the entire legal process to the point to where they showed up at events with real government credentials with the name of the wife of the protectee printed, in government credentials to prove that they were literally the spouse of this protectee, So that creates a whole myriad of different challenges, obviously requiring, much more intel to be able to cover that scope. But at the end of the day, the committed adversary knows no limits, and they just have to get creative once. And that situation blew my mind, especially when she got past the outer perimeter one time of an event and came sprinting across this venue towards the protectee, and I got to play. But it was insane that she had got in there.
I need to ask, because it's a fascinating case that you just outlined. I'm surprised that something like that would be legal, to change your name like that. Are there differences in different jurisdictions when attacking something like this, trying to do something like this? Or are there sort of places where it's easier or more difficult to pull something like that off?
You know, I'm not a legal expert, so I don't necessarily know, but changing your name to, XYZ, in my mind, isn't necessarily that hard. It's personal preference. There's not a trademark or a way to protect a celebrity's name, if you will.
Yeah, and chances are when they're going to change their name to, something associated with the celebrity, they're not telling law enforcement, or they're not filling out a form saying, I'm doing this because I'm stalking so-and-so and would like to appear as their, I don't know, wife, child, what have you. And so, as far as the people who are processing that paperwork are concerned, it's just an average citizen who wants to change their name to something. And they may not realize sort of the nefarious intent behind it. And if they haven't advertised the fact that they're doing it, people who are trying to investigate or are keeping tabs on that stalker might not even know they're doing it until it's done.
That makes sense. And going back a little bit, you already mentioned this a bit, Angie, and Caleb as well. People being quite creative, expecting sort of the obscure and unexpected in this. Some folks with psychological illnesses, but also other type of people. What sort of people do end up being stalkers? Do they come from a broader demographic, or is there sort of a typical type that you're looking for?
Yeah, they come from a wide range of backgrounds, and their motivations and behaviors and psychological profiles, those can all vary quite greatly. It's tempting to think of them as sort of the lonely weirdos. The reality is a little bit more complex than that. Many of the individuals who kind of engage in stalking behaviors or sort of inappropriate fixations, they don't fit into the stereotypical mold. Stalking can be perpetrated by people from all kinds of demographics, including those who might appear to be well-adjusted in society. There are always some psychological or emotional factors at play. So it kind of goes back to that obsessive or delusional thinking. Many stalkers, especially those with those tendencies that are obsessive or delusional, they'll become fixated on the idea that they have some sort of special or unique connection with that victim, but they don't always present as that lonely weirdo. So it's important to note that this holds true whether the person being stalked is a celebrity or maybe just an average citizen. So many stalkers do have personality disorders and or mental health issues and or attachment issues, but those underlying motivations can vary quite greatly.
I can think of several scenarios in my head of individuals who are psychologically unstable, who came from, upper class families, who are in the midst of upper, high level education through quality schools, and are consistently immersed in unacceptable stalking activity. They have the means, they have the resources, they have the capabilities, to fly cross country and do a lot of things, but their obsession with the protectee, it makes no sense other than they're psychologically disturbed. But those have been the ones that have surprised me more, than really the committed person that has nothing going for them outside of this stalking scenario.
So I just want to bring it back to the general kind of trend of celebrity stalking. Has this always been a threat? Is this something that, kind of early film and Hollywood celebrities would have had to think about? Or is this something that's evolved over time? And in particular, I'm wondering, has the growth in kind of celebrity gossip outlets, celebrity gossip media, has that fueled this in any way?
Yeah. So, I guess you could say as long as there have been famous people in the public eye, this has been a concern. But there has been an evolution of sorts over the past several years in terms of how it's perceived and how it's addressed. Not just celebrity gossip outlets, but I would say also the growth of social media has definitely exacerbated the perception of accessibility and connection with people who have these unhealthy fixations. Fans often deeply identify with the personal narratives or those public personas, as Caleb had mentioned earlier about some of these celebrities. which can lead to sort of that overestimation of the intimacy or personal connection that they have with the person that they're stalking. So, some local police departments have specialized in the focus of preventing and managing these types of threats. And, there obviously has been an evolution of personal protection as well in terms of how they approach it, how they consider, the more data that we have, the longer this goes on, the more expertise is developed as well in terms of how to combat it. But I would say that the growing recognition that, stalkers could pose significant risks to not just the public figures, but to ordinary citizens as well has really advanced since maybe the 1990s. Stalking and those related behaviors were kind of obviously, fueled by those obsessive fixations, but there was a shift in kind of how seriously it was taken by law enforcement. I think it was the early 90s when California had its anti-stalking law passed, which criminalized stalking and set the stage for a more organized and professional law enforcement response to this type of threat. And, that kind of stemmed from, I believe it was the murder of actress Rebecca Schaeffer. But obviously, even before that, you had John Lennon's murder in 1980 by Mark David Chapman, who believed that killing Lennon would make him famous. And of course, you already mentioned the incident related to John Hinckley. So, I mentioned this evolution of how stalking is handled and the role of social media has played in it. And then, of course, cyber stalking and social media threats have only increased that. The challenge is stalkers not only target people in the physical world, but online as well. And some use social media to harass, threaten, and intimidate their victims. You have your keyboard warriors just as much as you have the people who are, taking action in the physical world as well.
And you look at the salient connection between the need for celebrities to have that personal connection with their fans and the desire of psychologically unstable individuals to further that connection, right? There's that fine balance that if the celebrity doesn't have that intimate dynamic with their fans of, oh, you're my number one fan, and, all of those things that create that celebrity status, if they don't have that, they're no longer a celebrity. They become a B-lister and move on out of the way, and somebody else fills those shoes. So it's a intentionally kind of tedious balance between having the crazy fans who go crazy when you arrive at the restaurant or wherever, and having the fans that go beyond the crazy fan and become the crazy stalker fan, right? So it's kind of a problem that's built into the culture of celebrities as a whole. And, the legislation over the years has worked to try to create buffers and boundaries. But we also know that there's limited levels of success with legislation, enforcement of legislation, as well as the digital threats that progress from that. You look at, it is much easier for a nefarious actor to have intrusive interventions in the celebrity's life now through doxing, through, digital footprints and things like that. All of those things we didn't have in years past and decades past. Now that is an additional layer of stalking that can get a stalker even closer to the celebrity if we aren't, actively mitigating that.
What would be the most dangerous types of events or public appearances for celebrities? How does that risk compare then to, when they're in their own home or in other private spaces, at friend's house, partying together in the club somewhere? Like what are the differences between these and what type of locations would be sort of most exposed?
I mean, I would say in many ways it really depends on the celebrity and the nature of the stalker's fixation, and also just the nature of who the celebrity is and kind of what they typically do, their typical behaviors and activities. Generally, I would say ones that involve large crowds can be difficult to, mitigate against. There's also those intimate interactions, the one-on-one or small group interactions can be great opportunities for a stalker to, kind of approach physically, which can be very, very uncomfortable and create, at a minimum, an awkward situation. And then, of course, those where there are minimal security, those would be the ones that could generally present the most significant risks, which those three aspects probably run the gamut of like all types of events. So we've talked about how the stalkers are so often motivated by that obsessive desire for personal connection. And these types of events can often provide them with the opportunities to approach, interact with, or even sort of engage in or infiltrate in that celebrity's life.
From my experience, I've seen the greatest risk to my celebrity protectees introduced through unanticipated environments. So let's say the protectee is going to an environment that has, individuals in that environment that are more dangerous than their typical environment. Oftentimes that will make me worry more than if they're going to the Oscars or going to a celebrity infused event, because oftentimes the expectations around celebrity events involve a lot of law enforcement, a lot of planning, a lot of, redundant layers of protection, to where a lot of these, events or clubs or different environments, house parties that the celebrities go to have zero infrastructure, have zero, planning. It's just a bunch of people going to have fun. And a lot of people that are there to have fun aren't security minded. And so introducing the celebrity who typically might not need an elevated security posture goes into that environment, and then all of a sudden finds themselves as, a secondary impact of a consequence that was intended for somebody else, And I can think of, off the top of my head, 5 different situations that my teams have encountered where that has happened. And just like that, it became extremely, apparent that this is not the place we want to be right now.
Well, we're talking to Dr. Angie Lewis and Caleb Gilbert about the threats to celebrities from stalkers. After the break, we'll talk about protection and security.
You have been listening to How to Get on a Watchlist, the podcast series from Encyclopedia Geopolitica. If you like this show, don't forget to check out our other content at Encyclopedia Geopolitica, which you can find at howtogetonawatchlist.com, where you can find our analysis on various geopolitical issues, as well as reading lists covering topics like those discussed in the podcast. Please also consider subscribing to the podcast on your streaming platform of choice, giving us a rating, and joining our Patreon.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about how we can defend against this threat then. So what sort of security arrangements do celebrities have? Talk us through what that kind of looks like from end to end, from keeping a celebrity safe as they go out and do their jobs.
Yeah. So I think it runs the gamut, and it really depends on, again, the celebrity, what their level of prominence is in the public eye. Can be everything from, it can start with, people who are there to monitor the interactions on their social media, to kind of see what's out there, what kind of comments are being made, what their fan base is interacting with. And a lot of times this actually pops up very easily just in terms of publicity. PR teams are starting to see these things because they recognize awkward interactions or things that are kind of amiss from, the norm. And so that's a lot of times, a good starting point. But, you'll have everything from that straight to, physical security teams with drivers, and you'll establish, guards at doors for events and, things like that. So it can really run a pretty wide array of security options depending on the level of perceived threat to an individual. And then also, what the level of comfort is for, that talent in terms of, do they want something that is a bit more of a, prominent stance where, they have bodyguards who are, physically present and there and, kind of visible, or do they want something that's going to be a little bit more under wraps where maybe people don't always realize what their level of security is. So it can really be quite a wide array.
And really looking at the specific threats of each celebrity is very important, because when you say celebrity, that covers such a broad swath of individuals. But let's face it, not every celebrity can afford the level of protection they need. So oftentimes we see the studios are the ones that are actually providing the security for a lot of these celebrities, because in order to sustain the salaries, in order to be able to effectively mitigate the risks, it costs more money than most celebrities have, in their disposable resources. Looking at even the A-list celebrities, there's a lot of room for improvement, because traditionally speaking, we're looking at guards, guns, and gates as the traditional mechanisms of mitigating these risks. With the new risks that have come on board, we have to look beyond that. One of the things that we focus on is digital executive protection, taking a look at each individual's digital footprint, look at the people around them, find where the bad actors might use it as a vector to get in? Is it the staff? Is it their protection team? Like I mentioned before, I had paparazzi followed me home after I worked for an A-list celebrity, offering me millions of dollars to collaborate with them on a shop. What is that risk vector that comes in, and how can we get ahead of that? That is really what I suggest, people focus is the primary focus of what I do, is what is digital executive protection? What level of protection is appropriate for the celebrity based on the risks that are facing them? And how can you prioritize the mitigation strategies based on the needs of that specific celebrity?
Caleb brings up a really great point there in terms of the digital protection and what does that look like. And so for a lot of folks, our public information is out there, your address, your phone number, things like that, at a very basic level, making those things harder to come by, obscuring that information, whether it's by legal means and sort of creating addresses that, maybe are more visible, but are not the physical address of the home, things like that. So there are ways of, at a baseline, undermining the ability of a stalker to find that individual. It can also be, means of trying to alter their pattern of life, the things that, what's the route to work, or, are they doing the same thing every single day? And so making it just a little bit more difficult to find that information online in the digital world, I think can be really, really important. And it's a very important first step for a lot of celebrities, whether it's A-list executives, like those kinds of things too. So that is a very important piece that Caleb brought up.
One of the things that I love to do on my teams is host vulnerability assessments, literally taking a look at their digital footprint and see, all right, if there are hostiles out there seeking to do nefarious things to the people we're entrusted to protect, what can we do, both from an intel perspective and a protective perspective, to prioritize the risk mitigation strategies that will be most effective?
Yeah, that makes sense. And Caleb, you also mentioned costs earlier. I'm very curious, how much does security for an A-list celebrity cost? And what's the range of the size of a security team or other protective teams that are working for something like that? Be it the people looking at, online presence, social media, the bodyguards, everyone else looking at cameras, whatnot. How big is that whole operation, and how do you pay for that, and how much is it?
Definitely. It's an interesting discussion. I just actually finished an 18-month analysis of the industry to look at where the numbers are. And surprisingly, the celebrities' amount that they spend on their protection teams is relatively low. Now, I'd make the argument that those low numbers are by and large because they're hiring individuals that may not necessarily be able to mitigate the level of risk that they're faced with. If you have a security posture that includes at least intelligence assets, so you're actually doing a risk-based protection program. If you're including a team with a structured physical security presence, structured security posture that is all inclusive of this celebrity's lifestyle, it's not cheap. It can be anywhere from one agent to quite a few agents, and it's not cheap to mitigate the risk that you see in a lot of these celebrities. You look at a lot of the numbers have been posted from royalty details going into LA and a lot of their spends that are shared back and forth. And I will say that those numbers are very much inaccurate. The average celebrity themselves pays less than most people think. And the average celebrity that has a sufficient security posture pays more than people think.
Caleb, you mentioned earlier, paparazzi trying to pay you off to participate. So I just want to dive back in on that. What does insider risk look like in celebrity protection? How do you assure privacy and security when anyone in their entourage could face similar incentives? And also, I imagine people want to brag, people want to share things about what they do, and I imagine that carries a lot of risk too.
Absolutely. I would say that the insider risk of celebrities is more of a risk than certainly is attributed to it, simply because of the culture of the celebrity scene. By and large, you look at individuals who are working in Hollywood the majority of the time with these celebrities. You're talking about individuals that are either in a secondary phase of their career, did something else and they're doing this part-time. Or you're talking about individuals who are trying to become celebrities themselves and are doing this as kind of a secondary plan because they couldn't make it as a celebrity themselves. And so a lot of my interactions with people in Hollywood, to be perfectly frank, were less than professional. They were people that were there to make a buck. They were there to make a living, and they didn't aspire to the same level of professionalism as I've seen in a lot of other verticals within the protection world, So I'd say this is definitely an area that can increase, but also you get what you pay for. At the end of the day, if you're going to pay somebody a security guard fee to stand in front of a A-list celebrity's house, and you're going to expect them not to take a multi-million-dollar bribe, are you basing your expectations on reality, or are you actually curating a team that can accurately protect the risks facing your protectee? I think it has to be a holistic process, looking at the overall culture of the organization. Unfortunately, Hollywood has so much turnover that it's ridiculous. You see contracts turning over all the time, and oftentimes they turn over for a $2 an hour, rate change in the guard fee, and so with that turnover comes a lot of individuals who are not necessarily loyal to the brand, loyal to the celebrity, and not loyal to the company. And that brings with it animosity, hurt feelings, and exposure to a lot of the tell-alls that we've seen, from both East Coast and West Coast celebrities, to where the individual has zero professionalism. And so they write a book about the inner dwellings of the celebrity's life. And, I've been in several situations over the course of my career to where somebody that I worked with wrote a book. And it made me so mad because, 90% of the book was completely false, but they actually worked the celebrity. So they sold it, they made their money and went on to something else, And so the harm to reputation of the protection industry is what I see as the greatest risk there. Because most people know that some of the outlandish things that some of the, people that expose celebrities say aren't actually grounded in truth.
Yeah. Caleb's talking about this, it extends to the entire entourage too, right? So, you have a lot of people who want to be close to a celebrity for a number of reasons, not all of them due to loyalty. And that can be, they may not be a professional, and it could be, whether it's, in a PR role or, something like that as well. So that actually also feeds into that psychological risk that a lot of, celebrities face, because that isolationism, who can you trust? Who do you know that genuinely has your back? If somebody's going to try to pay off someone in your entourage to get the shot, or, to put you in a position where they can approach you or what have you, can you trust the people around you? And that's really challenging. And so, having somebody in a security intel role who can do effective background checks, who can understand sort of the motivations of the people around that celebrity, can only serve to, help and support them. But again, it's not something that is incredibly cheap. So being able to kind of have that support system can be really important depending on how high level, a star rises.
I just want to drill down on something you said there, Angie. You talked about, the intel role in the background. How is intelligence, and in particular, I'm quite interested about open source intelligence changing the protection game. I regularly see celebrity jets being tracked openly online. There are entire accounts dedicated, in some cases, to tracking single celebrities' jets. I'd imagine this level of just access to information about people's movements probably makes protection a lot more challenging.
It definitely makes it more challenging. The amount of information that is out there about any one A-lister or executive can be incredibly disturbing from the side of a person who wants to protect that information, to protect that individual. And so, we talked a little bit about that digital footprint and, what are the means. And so kind of flipping OSINT on its head and being able to say, okay, if I do a vulnerability assessment and I look out there and I say, here's all this information I can find on this individual, a potential stalker can find that too. So then you have an idea of the ways that you want to approach what needs to be taken down, what can we do. And then, you have a lot of talent too that, maybe said some things they shouldn't have said earlier in their lives. And, that's not going to go well for their professional reputation as their star rises. And so knowing those things ahead of time and kind of just understanding the playing field, like what is out there that is going to present a concern that we can then address. And I think that's the first step of it. So, OSINT can be really useful for a stalker to go after, a victim, but it's also really useful for those of us who are trying to, serve as in the protection role and try to identify, what's out there and what are those risks that, they might face because of that information. So I would say that it kind of is a double-edged sword in that sense, but it's also kind of fascinating. And it goes back to, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit more later, just being cautious about what you're putting out there in the digital world too.
And I might add for that the importance of our analysts to convey that information in a way that the consumer can understand. One of the things that I've found over time is most of the time we develop these amazing reports and we submit them to the decision maker and they're like, that's great. I have no idea what you're saying, And so the process of actually immersing analysts in to understand what is important to the protectee and how to communicate in their language is something that I've found to be extremely useful, because being able to communicate, all right, this is your risk and how it relates to you personally. I know that you like to have your trip to Aspen every year at the same time here, but here's a blog entirely devoted to posting pictures of you getting on and off the plane there when you're always doing that, right? Like speaking in a way, conveying that risk in a way that they understand it to the decision maker is an incredibly important connection to have that valuable tool emphasized in a way they can understand and not feel almost belittled by.
You spoke a lot about, some of these celebrities not necessarily having the level of protection that they should. Have you ever come across situations where celebrities didn't actually want the protection that they clearly needed and that was being implemented for them? Or, where celebrities or even members of their close circle would try to escape and run away from their protection?
All the time. I've even had celebrities at award shows that came up to me and said, hey, I should have had somebody, this guy's following me. Can you come help me? When I'm working another protectee, it's like that buyer's remorse, it happens all the time, especially when they're familiar with you having a productive relationship with the protectee. Certainly, it's there. But at the end of the day, it is very expensive for a celebrity to have full-time protectors, and so for them to become comfortable, either has to take a catastrophic incident where they're introduced to competent individuals, or you have to have someone, really implementing a structured plan to be able to implement that with their long-term strategy and showing the risks that are associated with it,
All right. How would you investigate stalkers? And then once you have investigated them, how do you discourage any future iterations of something like that happening?
I know from my, perspective, the first thing that we generally do is we want to figure out who is this individual. Ideally, you want to know their motivation. You want to understand kind of where they're coming from and what their purpose is in stalking, because that gives you a little bit of insight into kind of what their end goal is and what their objective is. But really the first start is kind of understanding, identity, legal background, OSINT, if you can get some feedback on maybe they're, have they been charged with anything in the past? Do they have access to firearms? Do they, or, other weapons? Do they have a history of this type of behavior? Those kinds of things can be really, really important. Do they have the means to, if they say have sent a lot of emails or done things online, do they have the means to travel to where, the protectee is located? A lot of those different things are questions that we want to ask and we want to understand the background of. And so in that sense, really, you just do a deep dive. You want to know everything you possibly can about the individual, because that's what helps you to sort of assess the level of threat that they pose. But it, it starts with just starting that OSINT and kind of legal background is where I typically start. I don't know, Caleb, what about you?
Couldn't agree with you more. You look at your traditional vector for identifying a, threat, no threat. Do they have the means? Do they have the proximity? And do they have the intent, right? So pairing those three together, what I like to do is I like to ask my analysts to take a step back and put themselves in the shoes of the nefarious individual, right? Live a day in their shoes. When you're doing your work, when you're conducting your OSINT, whatever level that we're following through, look at it through their mind. Try to understand their perspective. If I was writing this post, what would my perspective be given that I have this XYZ background, right? Because so many things can get lost in the spaces and commas and answers and emotional responses versus, well-prepared responses. What is that driver going forward? And how could that impact what this person might or might not do? Obviously we can't guess. We don't have a crystal ball, but we do know that we can identify trends that will fall in line with trends that we know to either escalate or de-escalate the level of risk that these are facing. At the end of the day, we know that people that often have a flamboyant response oftentimes are less of a risk to actually committing the incident, statistically speaking, than someone who sits back and maybe has poignant, targeted answers, well-calculated answers, or things like that, right? And so, oftentimes the loudest person in the room is not necessarily the one who presents the greatest risk. And so understanding, all right, is this, perhaps a diversion? Is this a distraction? Is this someone that can be addressed by giving them a little bit of appropriate attention, or is this someone that is a motivated adversary who actually intends to carry out a nefarious act that could harm my protectee?
In the first half of the show, you talked about, social media and how it's somewhat fueling this risk. And that made me think about a robbery of a high-profile celebrity in Paris following, I believe, photos of some quite expensive jewelry in the hotel they were staying at being shared on social media. And I'm really curious, how are things like that handled by protective teams, especially given that celebrities they kind of need to be active on social media as part of their job? And I suppose a secondary question is, are there celebrities that are being trained to post on social media, but with, operational security in mind, to post with privacy in mind? How does that whole dynamic work?
I will tell you, there are some celebrities that I will not work with, and there's very specific reasons why I won't work with them. We talked about insider threats. We talked about threats that originate from the protectee. All of those things I think are salient in this discussion. I'm not going to point any fingers at, whom doing what, but I think, any investigation that lays out the logical framework of the series of events that leads to an incident like that leaves a lot of questions. We'll leave it at that, right? So I think that looking at individuals who are positioning themselves in a protective posture that they know is inadequate for the risks facing their protectee are two things. They're either intentional or they're purposefully, putting themselves in a position that they know will fail, right? So be cognizant of that. Celebrities are going to do what celebrities are going to do. Celebrities are celebrities for a reason. It's because they've done something to get attention of individuals. Celebrities oftentimes are not well structured. They don't have the, career progression of a lot of corporate leaders. They don't have a lot of, foundational basis for what they do. They just say crazy things. They do things that attract attention, and that attention attracts the crowds that compensate them, right? And so, I worked celebrities in the past to where I didn't even know who the celebrity was until I'd worked with them for over an hour, because they were a celebrity and they weren't acting like a celebrity. They were just acting like another cool cat on the cast, right? And then I've worked celebrities that said their own name 50 times before you met them. And it's just, you could tell it's all about them. And so I think celebrities have to attract attention. There's always expensive things around them. I will say that probably the most disappointing part of my early career was going and working my first Academy Awards. And right before the show started, I saw somebody spray painting the golden statue. And I was like, wait a minute, this isn't real gold. You got to be kidding me. Like, my entire image of this is crushed. So that was a little reality check on celebrity life. But That being said, there are real jewelry that go out with all of these celebrities. There is, insane amounts of valuable things. I will say that oftentimes celebrities will have protection that is paid for by the jewelry company and not by the celebrity themselves, which blew my mind when I first moved to Hollywood, because I was like, you want me to watch a bracelet for a week and a half? I'm flying all over the world watching a bracelet. This is kind of cool, But realistically, the value and the potential for loss for that piece is extreme, And so recognizing that, as well as where those threat vectors might come from, if this piece of jewelry has been well publicized that it's going to be at these three locations across the world in the next week, they're going to know that there's a lot of transit. There's a lot of, change in hands that's going to happen with it. Does that increase the need for a protective posture that is more comprehensive, right? All of those things, just kind of understanding the vector that different threats could follow to get to whatever it is you're protecting or whomever it is are incredibly important, as well as relying on your intel team for those tidbits of information.
Absolutely. Yeah. Caleb brought up that there is that gray area. You definitely have, some celebrities who are, doing everything they can to like garner that attention, and they're, posting things on social media and whatnot that, may not be advisable. And so, in an ideal world, you have somebody, on your protection team who is advising you and saying, hey, this is probably not a great idea. Maybe you don't want to do this, or at least helping to moderate how it's portrayed or posted or something like that, whether it's, after the fact or something along those lines, to not garner unwanted attention. But there's also wanted attention, and social media is really, really important for that, for a lot of celebrities and for brands. And so Caleb kind of brought up that like brand partnership. And so, whether, you have a high profile item with a high profile individual and you want them tied together on social media because it's going to garner attention, that presents a challenge for, people in the protection field, because now you have two things that are garnering attention and you kind of have this perfect storm. You can't say, no, we don't want to do that at all, because that's part of their celebrity. That's part of, their job effectively. But really trying to find a way to approach it so you're not engendering a risk that you don't need to, I think is the important thing. And you don't always have, some celebrities are very, very open to that, and some are not. And that's, I think, the challenge that Caleb was talking about, trying to figure out how to work with.
What about ordinary people that wouldn't have security teams like celebrities might have? Is there anything that a non-famous person can do to try and avoid sort of ending up in a situation like that with a stalker, and making sure they're not encouraging, but rather discouraging things? Anything in particular? We talked about OPSEC already, privacy. What can we normal folks do to avoid being in a situation like that?
I think this is a super important question. I know I personally have a very, very good friend who has been the victim of a stalker. And so I've definitely looked at this from a, not only being sort of in this protection field, but also as a best friend, and wanting to know the best ways to, protect her. So I'd say first and foremost, be mindful of personal boundaries and exercise clear communication. One of the kind of most important ways to avoid encouraging stalker behavior is by establishing and maintaining those clear boundaries early on. And that is in all types of relationships. If someone begins showing interest or behavior that feels too intense or inappropriate early, so maybe frequent communication or unwelcome attention, or maybe even emotional dependence of some sort, it's important to politely but firmly express the need for space and make it clear that behavior is not welcome. Once those boundaries are set, it's important to be consistent in reinforcing them. So mixed signals, such as being really friendly but not setting clear limits, that can confuse someone and might lead to them thinking that the relationship with them is maybe closer or more intimate than it actually is. And then, of course, being cautious with social media. That online presence is crucial. Limiting that personal information that is shared out there. Sharing too much personal information online can provide potential stalkers or stalkers with details about your daily life, your habits, where you are. Limiting what you post on social media and adjusting those privacy settings to control who sees your posts. Avoiding oversharing, refraining from posting your exact location and your schedule in real time, at least. Includes check-ins, photos of your home, overly personal content that might invite unwanted attention. I know we're, really talking about the average individual right now, but I can't tell you how many times I've seen a celebrity post something on social media that made me as a security professional want to cringe, because with just a couple of clicks on a Google Maps or a targeted search, I could identify exactly where they're located. And if I can do it, I'm sure somebody else can do it too. And it's even worse. I would say I'm a mom. So when they post things about their kids, to me, that's even more cringeworthy because, that is an additional consideration. I would also say, speaking of social media, it's important to review your connections regularly. People that you don't know well or who might have exhibited sort of inappropriate behavior, and secure your accounts using strong passwords and two-factor authentication, all those kinds of things as well. So I would say, being cautious with communication, setting boundaries, and trusting your intuition. That's an important one that I think a lot of people kind of ignore. They want to be friendly, they want to be nice, they want to be, polite, but it is okay to be direct and polite. So if you're receiving unwanted or uncomfortable attention, addressing it immediately. You don't have to engage in prolonged conversations, but you have to set that boundary early and be confident about it. Because giving attention to someone who's behaving inappropriately can encourage further unwanted attention. So staying firm, kind of making sure that things are progressing, whether it's a friendship or relationship, a new contact, that's progressing at a rate that is comfortable and not overly intimate too quickly. I think those are also important. And then, knowing how to block and report unwanted behavior and knowing what resources are available to you, I think are important too.
Absolutely. I would say digital executive protection isn't just for celebrities or executives. The individual can go out to a company like, 360 Privacy or somebody like that has the access to be able to go in and do those digital sweeps and let you know what information is out there and what you can do to mitigate it. At the end of the day, you look at most threat vectors that impact an individual, they're through personal relationships, but they're compounded by their digital footprint. And so, being able to take and try and do as much as you can to eliminate, exactly like Angie said, eliminate that as much as possible or mitigate what you can't eliminate. Extremely important. The other thing is, simple things. Take a screenshot of your photo before you, post it online. Sure, most of the social media, will scrub that now, but some of them do not, right? And so little things, proactive things that you can do. Take a look and see. And also, for ladies that are out there meeting a new individual, do a little bit of open source yourself. Be proactive, with your life and just see, is this individual, someone who I want to, move forward with? Is there anything I should be worried about? Right? Proactive steps like that are very useful, don't cost a lot of money, and can save tons of grief when it comes to, somebody that becomes obsessed or does activities that are out of line with expectations.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you so much.
So one question we always finish this show on is what keeps you up at night? Working in a world where the stakes are pretty high, given some of the the risks we've talked about here. What was the nightmare scenario? What's the biggest risk here?
I would say for me, the secondary and tertiary impacts of AI definitely are impacts that keep me up at night. The more I become aware of the potential, the more I'm looking for reassurance that there's mitigation strategies that are being developed, alongside. Obviously, we don't necessarily know the full impact and what it will bring, but what we do know is that the landscape is changing. And so the risk mitigation strategies that have worked in years past, in decades past, aren't necessarily going to correlate to what will help us tomorrow. And to me, it's a challenge. To me, it's something that excites me and scares me at the same time, because the consequences can be so deeply personal with the evolution of technology, with the development into areas that it's new territory, it's a new frontier, and exciting and scary at the same time.
Yeah, I agree. Caleb brought up a key word for me, and that's the deeply personal nature of all of this stuff. And that is the thing that bothers me the most, both when it comes to stalkers who may have, an emotional feel that they have an emotional connection with a celebrity, with a protectee, but then also just the emotional impact it has on celebrities, on people who are victims of stalking, and just knowing that even though we can mitigate a lot of these risks, when it does happen, it has those psychological impacts. And that bothers me to no end, because that's not something that I can fix. So it's really avoidance and trying to stop it from happening before it does is the only way to kind of avoid those emotional scars. And so that's what I think bothers me the most about it.
Dr. Angie Lewis and Caleb Gilbert, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having us.
You've been listening to How to Get on a Watchlist. Our producer for this episode was Edwin Tran. Our researchers were Alex Smith and Archie Hickox. To all our listeners and Patreon supporters, thank you so much for listening to and supporting How to Get on a Watchlist.
If you enjoyed this show, please consider checking out our other content at Encyclopedia Geopolitica. We'd also appreciate it if you could subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, or support us on Patreon. Thanks for listening.
What's your emergency?